When they first compiled the damage report on the Beauchamp plantation in the summer of 1850, the initial figures were considered impossible, a sign of widespread clerical error or gross exaggeration designed to inflate insurance claims. It was impossible, investigators argued, for an operation of that magnitude, an economic engine covering 34,000 acres, secured by 82 armed personnel employed across 2 rotating shifts, to be utterly dismantled in less than 72 hours. The estimated loss, accounting for harvested and processed sugar, infrastructure, livestock, and forced labor capital, approached $300,000, a staggering sum for the period. Every single structure of economic value, from the main refinery and the massive curing houses to the critical stores of molasses and the owner's opulent residence, was consumed by a methodical, controlled conflagration. The paradox that stunned the Louisiana authorities and sent silent tremors of dread through every planter across the Deep South was simple and terrifying. The evidence suggested the devastation was wrought not by a massive, organized external insurrection, but by a solitary actor. The subsequent and exhaustive investigations concluded there had been no outside involvement, no organized political movement assisting the assault. The entire intricate mechanism of one of the richest sugar plantations in St. Landry Parish had been systematically collapsed by a single individual. And that individual, according to the stark, unforgiving ledger of human chattel, was a boy of 14 years, listed only as Cyrus. This was not a common tale of escape, a desperate sprint for the Northern Star. This was an act of calculated, precise demolition. It was a level of strategic execution that the official records attempted to scrub and bury for over a century and a half, fearful of the precedent it set and the dark, potent legend it fueled among the oppressed. How could such a young boy, without access to advanced weaponry or tactical training, not only escape the seemingly inescapable gravitational pull of the plantation system, but also turn its immense infrastructure against itself with devastating efficiency? To understand the scope of this historical anomaly, one must first anchor themselves in the suffocating reality of the Louisiana Delta in August 1850. The Beauchamp plantation stood as a monument to institutionalized cruelty and profit, carved out of the primeval swamps and bayous that defined the region. This was a land where the air itself was thick, humid, and heavy with the scent of fermenting sugar and the ever-present threat of disease. The environment was an active character in the system of oppression. The impenetrable tangle of cypress knees, Spanish moss, and sluggish malarial waters ensured that any attempt at escape was fraught with peril, transforming the surrounding wilderness into a natural extension of the prison walls. The system of chattel slavery here operated under conditions that historical medical records consistently describe as incompatible with life-prolonged past rigorous necessity. The law provided planters with total, unquestioned dominion, treating human beings as purely fungible assets. Control was maintained through constant surveillance, psychological terror, and the omnipresent threat of the whip and the chain. The Beauchamp was renowned, even among its contemporaries, for its merciless efficiency, enforced by a sizable, well-equipped security force comprised mostly of former frontier militiamen and veterans of the Mexican-American War, men whose skill set was honed in violence and focused solely on the preservation of property. Cyrus, the protagonist of this chilling document of resistance, was introduced to the plantation's documentation not as a person, but as a unit of labor acquired in 1845. His presentation in the records is subtly different from the typical brutal accounting. He was not listed for exceptional physical strength or endurance, though his survival indicated a formidable toughness inherited from years of forced labor. Instead, the plantation's master, and more notably the overseer, noted an unusual aptitude for numbers and a disconcerting capacity for observation. Cyrus did not exhibit the typical signs of overt rebellion that planters were trained to recognize. He did not challenge authority openly, nor did he attempt the immediate, desperate flight seen so often. His rebellion was internalized, intellectual. He spent his few hours of rest not in sleep, but in mapping the drainage systems of the fields, memorizing the firing rotation of the guards, tracking the seasonal ebb and flow of the bayou waters, and calculating the thermal properties of the drying cane stalks piled high in the refinery yard. He knew every mile of that territory, not just through travel, but through analytical study. He was, in effect, performing a quiet, years-long reconnaissance mission against his captors, the first documented instance of a conflict involving Cyrus that transcended the standard violence of the fields, occurred precisely 2 days before the devastation began. The event is recorded in a frantic entry in the Overseer's Journal, dated August 10, 1850, and concerned a potentially catastrophic miscalculation of storage capacity for a fresh shipment of sugar destined for New Orleans. Cyrus, while assisting the inventory clerk, a rare assignment granted due to his perceived mathematical prowess, had attempted to convey, through careful use of measured volume and density metrics, that the planned storage would lead to an inevitable collapse of the structure due to heat stress and pressure, likely destroying the entire shipment. The overseer, a man named Bartholomew, a tyrant defined by arrogance and ingrained racial prejudice, dismissed the warning with contemptuous brutality. He could not conceive that the numerical precision of a piece of property could surpass his own, especially when that precision was based on nothing but pure, abstract calculation. The sugar was stored as planned. Hours later, the structural integrity failed, burying the shipment and costing the plantation owner thousands in immediate, irreplaceable losses. The consequence for Bartholomew was a public, humiliating censure. The consequence for Cyrus, though never detailed in the records, was undoubtedly severe and served as the final, irreversible catalyst. The overseer's entry ends with a terse, chilling note. The boy was dealt with accordingly. He disappeared from the main yard by midnight. Assume flight. Raise the alarm. 3 hours later, the main alarm bell of the Beauchamp plantation sounded, an insistent clang that cut through the humid night air. But this was not the sound of a standard alarm. It was a call to arms, spurred by the discovery that 2 veteran perimeter guards, positioned at the crucial northwest crossing near the levee, had failed to respond to the initial check. Their posts were vacant, their rifles were untouched, and there were no tracks leading out. Only subtle, barely perceptible disturbances in the soft, dark soil leading into the treacherous, densely wooded acreage bordering the plantation's main artery. How was this possible? How could a boy, presumed exhausted and desperate from recent punishment, execute an act of resistance against professional armed men before they even realized they were under threat? This was the first open loop in the narrative, the initial question that eroded the certainty of the hunters. What explained his immediate, tactical superiority over men who had spent their lives mastering the hunt? And why, when the specialized hounds were brought out, expensive, highly trained animals known for their relentless pursuit, did they mill nervously near the edge of the cane fields, refusing to enter the dense shadows of the trees, whimpering as if sensing something fundamentally unnatural waiting for them? Colonel Silas Thorne, a man whose reputation was built on his absolute ruthlessness in recapturing runaways, was hired instantly to lead the official pursuit. Thorne assembled his company immediately. 25 hardened riders, equipped with long rifles, tracking gear, and an overwhelming, arrogant confidence. They were not expecting a fight. They were hunting fugitive property, and they believed the oppressive heat and the psychological burden of flight would deliver the boy into their hands within 24 hours. Their initial plan, laid out over crude maps in the main house, was simple. establish a cordon, drive the boy into the open, and neutralize him either through fatigue or overwhelming force. They anticipated panic, desperation, and random movement through the environment. What they did not anticipate, as they advanced deeper into the shadowy, labyrinthine terrain of the bayou, was precision. The first indication that this was not a simple flight came late on the afternoon of the first day. Thorne's lead scout reported back, his face drawn not from heat, but from bewilderment. They had found the trail, unmistakable small prints in the mud, but these prints did not lead randomly. They led purposefully toward the deepest, most treacherous sections of the swamp, areas even Thorne's men usually avoided due to the risks posed by predatory wildlife and inescapable muck. More disturbingly, they found evidence that the path had been deliberately modified. Small, barely visible sticks were woven into the roots of the cypress trees, acting as markers. These markers, upon closer inspection, were angled in a specific, intentional manner, guiding the pursuit not away, but directly onto ground that was increasingly unstable and difficult to traverse. This was the start of the psychological terror, the erosion of certainty. Why guide the hunters? Why lead them further into terrain that was inherently hostile to men on horseback? The first losses, though not immediate, were recorded as early as the second day. 5 men failed to return to the evening muster point. The official records, later transcribed by the local sheriff to mask the severity of the disaster, attributed these losses simply to accidents of terrain and the ever-present dangers of the Louisiana wilderness, a fall into a hidden sinkhole, a mishap with a poisonous snake, or the sheer fatigue of wading through chest-high water under the relentless sun. But the men who remained, the veterans of Thorne's company, understood the language of the wilderness. Accidents in the bayou did happen, but 5 simultaneous, separate accidents among trained men suggested something fundamentally different. It suggested deliberate placement. The environment was not merely a passive obstacle, it was weaponized. Cyrus knew where the ground was weakest, where the water concealed the deepest drops, and where the shadows provided the perfect screen for movement. On the morning of the 3rd day, the men found a disturbing object. Hidden beneath a layer of swamp grass, where Cyrus had evidently rested, they discovered a slate tablet. It wasn't the material that was surprising. Materials were sometimes salvaged from the plantation. It was the content. Scrawled across the slate were geometric diagrams, complex sketches mapping the prevailing wind directions, the structural weak points of the refinery layout, and most chillingly, an accurate rendering of Thorne's expected tactical advance routes based on standard military doctrine. The realization began to dawn, heavy and cold, as the swamp water they traversed. This was not a desperate runaway fighting for survival. This was a mind honed by years of silent observation and intellectual calculation, executing a pre-planned operation. They were not tracking a panicked boy. They were engaging in a highly asymmetric conflict orchestrated by a genius trapped within the system. The sheer scale of the preparation was staggering. It indicated that Cyrus had spent years compiling data, years calculating his move, waiting for the perfect confluence of climate, resource availability, and the distraction of the harvest to launch his campaign of strategic destruction. Every action taken since his disappearance had been an exercise in control. The terrain, once familiar and manageable, began to turn against Thorne's men with unnerving consistency. Their horses became spooked, stumbling on carefully concealed snares made of woven vine. The dense heat seemed to intensify specifically around their positions, while small pockets of thick, blinding fog would settle unexpectedly only over the routes they planned to take. The men started whispering about the boy's impossible knowledge, about the territory that seemed to listen to him, and about the unsettling fact that every mile they advanced felt less like a pursuit and more like walking deeper into a trap designed with relentless mathematical precision. They were surrounded by evidence of Cyrus, but they never saw him. They only felt the results of his presence. They began to realize, with a terror far greater than facing an armed enemy, that they were not hunting. They were being lured. They were being systematically picked apart piece by piece, their resources drained, and their confidence eroded by an enemy who used the very land they sought to conquer as his ultimate weapon. The initial confidence of the 25 riders had evaporated completely. The fear of the unseen enemy began to surpass the discipline of their training. They were not fighting a boy, they were fighting the bayou itself, guided by the silent, relentless hand of Cyrus. This was when Colonel Thorne first uttered the thought that would define the rest of their disastrous pursuit, a moment recorded in the subsequent testimony of his sole surviving second-in-command. "This is not a flight," Thorne reportedly muttered, wiping the sweat from his face and scanning the silent, oppressive canopy above. "This is a siege, and we are already inside it." The plantation, the symbol of absolute power, had been destroyed by fire and calculation. Now, the hunting party, the symbol of absolute authority, was about to face a destruction far more terrifying, a systematic psychological dismantling orchestrated by the boy genius they tragically underestimated. The response to the destruction that had swept through the plantation fields and the central processing house was immediate and disproportionate. Records from the neighboring parish, later consulted by official inquiry, indicate that within 6 hours of the inferno starting, a formidable patrol unit had been assembled. It consisted of the chief overseer, a veteran of frontier conflicts known only in the documents as Silas, 4 hired security men, all former army personnel, and 15 local volunteers drawn from the surrounding properties, motivated by fear of widespread insurrection and a guaranteed bounty for the subject's capture or death. In total, a heavily armed force of 20 individuals, equipped with hounds and long rifles, began the chase. Their initial confidence was absolute. The subject was a boy of 14 years, slight of build, documented as having spent his entire short life within the confines of the plantation boundaries, save for fleeting, unsuccessful attempts at flight. The surrounding Louisiana bayou, a tangled maze of swamp cypress and water moccasin territory, was viewed not as a sanctuary for the fugitive, but as a trap designed to slow his eventual collapse. The men fully expected to return within 48 hours, dragging the boy back to face a documented fate intended to serve as a brutal and final example. The first indication that this pursuit would defy established expectations arrived before the sun had fully broken over the humid, stagnant waters of the cypress swamp. The dogs, trained specialized trackers brought in from a neighboring county, began their work with urgency, but quickly encountered difficulty. They did not lose the trail. Rather, the trail itself became an aberration. In the thick, muddy ground where clear prints should have registered, the evidence was sparse, almost ethereal. The boy, known only through the records as Subject 734, seemed to skim the surface, navigating the tricky geography with a supernatural lightness the heavy-booted men could not match. By midday, the patrol was already exhausted, not by distance, but by the terrain's relentless opposition. The August heat of the Louisiana Delta settled over them like a physical weight, drawing sweat and energy in equal measure. The air was so dense with moisture and the miasma of decay that it felt less like breathing and more like inhaling thin, hot soup. This environment, which the patrol expected to favor their greater physical bulk and armament, began immediately to erode their morale. Then came the first of the incidents attributed in the official journals to accidents of terrain. Jebediah, one of the local volunteers and a man known for his sure-footedness on the trapline, failed to respond to the noon muster. When the group doubled back along the narrow path, they found no sign of a struggle, no blood, and no weapon dropped. They only found a patch of disturbed water where the path met the deeper swamp edge. Silas, the overseer, dismissed the incident as a drowning or a heart attack induced by the heat and the exertion, a common tragedy in the hostile bayou. Yet the unsettling silence of the area and the fact that Jebediah was intimately familiar with that specific stretch of water planted the first seed of systemic doubt. The true moment of pattern interruption occurred later that evening, as the patrol attempted to make camp on a slightly elevated ridge of land. The scout, checking the perimeter before darkness fell, discovered a series of subtle, almost invisible alterations to the immediate landscape. Small markers, notches cut into cypress bark just above the reach of floodwaters, were identified. These were not random markings. They were signs used by experienced maroons or perhaps local indigenous trappers to indicate safe passage or, critically, areas to be avoided due to quicksand or unstable ground. The implications were profound. The boy, who was supposed to be fleeing in blind panic, had been navigating a terrain he knew intimately, using sophisticated methods of orientation. More disturbingly, the markings suggested a pre-existing knowledge of escape routes, indicating weeks, perhaps months, of subtle, silent preparation while laboring under the relentless gaze of the system. This was not improvised flight. It was a planned deployment. The morale of the 20 men, already fractured by the environment and the unexplained loss of one member, began its sharp decline. Silas, refusing to acknowledge the possibility that his prey was mentally superior, insisted that the markings were old, misleading, or simply the work of local itinerants. But the soldiers among the hired security detail exchanged glances. They recognized the deliberate nature of tactical misdirection. As day 2 dawned, the pursuit continued, but the swagger had been replaced by a cautious, almost terrified slowness. The path forward was now viewed with suspicion. Every shadow became a potential threat. The heat escalated, twisting the perception of distance and sound. 2 more men vanished before sunset on the second day. One was found hours later, trapped in a sinkhole that had been expertly concealed by a layer of floating river grass, a natural hazard amplified by tactical placement. He was alive, but non-responsive, severely dehydrated, and suffering from shock. The second disappearance was far more troubling. The man, positioned as the rear guard, simply ceased communicating. His rifle and gear were found meticulously stacked against a tree stump, but he himself was gone. The record simply logged these incidents under the category of operational failure. Silas was forced to confront the impossibility. The team was now down to 17 men, and they had not yet had a single direct contact with the fugitive. Their overwhelming numerical superiority and technological advantage, rifles and trained dogs, were being neutralized by the one thing they had failed to account for: the subject's intimate, almost symbiotic relationship with the environment they despised and struggled to penetrate. The pursuit morphed into a psychological ordeal. The pursuers were no longer tracking, they were being led. Subject 734, Elijah, as his mother had named him, was using the bayou as a weapon, employing a form of environmental warfare that negated the patrol's training. The constant, invisible presence of danger began to break down the highly structured military thinking of the hired security detail. They were trained to fight an army. They were not trained to fight a shadow in the swamp. The relentless moisture caused their expensive powder to clump, rendering some of their heavy rifles unreliable. The constant biting insects drove them into fits of frustrated rage, and always there was the unsettling realization that the boy, small and supposedly weak, was enduring this same environment with impunity. One of the former soldiers, a man named Henderson, voiced the growing dread during a tense, whispered conference on the 3rd night. "We haven't seen a thing, not a flicker, but 3 men are gone, and look at the water. We've walked in a circle twice this afternoon. He's running us into the thickest parts of the swamp. He knows what the water does to us, Silas. He knows the heat." The response from the overseer was purely defensive, rooted in the rigid logic of the system. He is a runaway chattel. He is scared and desperate. It is the swamp, nothing more. We will push on at first light. But the seeds of panic were sown. The men began to exhibit signs of acute psychological distress. They started seeing the boy in the dense, shifting shadows of the cypress trees. They heard movements that were not there. The fear that the fugitive was always watching, always a few yards ahead, calculating their next move, became an unbearable weight. The environment seemed to conspire against them. On the fourth day, a deep, choking fog rolled in from the marshlands, settling close to the ground. It was an unnatural, blinding mist that reduced visibility to mere feet, turning the pursuit into an exercise in terrifying guesswork. Silas ordered the patrol to group tightly, relying solely on the sound of each other's voices. This provided momentary comfort, but it was a tactical blunder. In grouping, they sacrificed maneuverability, becoming one large, slow, confused target for a predator that moved with silence and precision. It was during this period of blindness that the two remaining tracking dogs were lost. They had been tethered tightly to the handlers, but the fog, combined with the dense undergrowth, allowed them to be silently separated from the group. When the handlers realized their absence, they found only the leather leads, severed cleanly with what must have been a very sharp instrument. The significance of this discovery was devastating. It proved that the boy was not merely fleeing the patrol's advance, he was actively dismantling their means of tracking, demonstrating a strategic forethought that entirely contradicted the official assessment of his intellectual capacity. The records of the plantation had dismissed Subject 734 as merely competent in accounting and arithmetic, but otherwise docile. The man standing over the severed leads realized that those records were dangerously wrong. By the end of the fourth day, the realization shifted, hardening into a terrifying certainty among the few remaining rational men in the patrol. The initial objective, capture, was forgotten. Survival became the dominant thought. The patrol was no longer the hunter, they were the hunted. The terrain had become a meticulously constructed labyrinth, and they were caught inside. The boy, who had been raised under the heel of this oppressive system, was now using every scrap of forced knowledge, the seasonal high points, the deep game trails, the patterns of the nocturnal wildlife, to orchestrate a campaign of attrition. The terror peaked when they finally found a clear message left for them, a deliberate provocation that defied the logic of a desperate fugitive. It was a small pile of their own stolen rations, dried meat and hard biscuits, placed conspicuously on a smooth, white piece of driftwood in the center of a small clearing. The food was untouched, but surrounding it were tiny, meticulous boot prints, indicating that the subject had paused there, likely watching them search desperately for signs of him, before placing the offering of food as a grotesque symbol of his control. The message was clear, though unspoken. I know where you are. I know what you need, and I am not hungry. This singular moment, documented in the margin of Silas's journal, marked the complete erosion of their certainty. The men understood then the nature of their predicament. This was not a pursuit in the conventional sense. This was a siege, and they were caught within its terrifying, humid walls, cornered by a genius boy whose resistance was proving to be total and planned, transforming the oppressive Louisiana swamp into the tomb of their arrogance. The third day of the hunt across the sprawling marshlands of Iberville Parish, Louisiana, marked a chilling and fundamental pivot in the operation. It was the point where the relentless pursuit, fueled by the surety of systemic authority, began its inexorable transformation into a localized, panicked siege. Of the original 23 seasoned trackers and plantation enforcers dispatched to retrieve the 14-year-old fugitive, only 10 remained under the direct, increasingly erratic command of Captain Silas. The atmosphere itself had become a character of pure malevolence. The bayou was not merely an obstacle, it was an active combatant, seemingly manipulated by an unseen intelligence. The relentless August humidity pressed down like a physical weight, thick enough to muffle sound and dissolve certainty. They moved through an oppressive green twilight, where the distinction between solid ground and waterlogged decay was lethal and often imperceptible. The air was a soup of cypress musk and putrefaction, the soundtrack provided only by the incessant mocking chorus of cicadas and the occasional deep groan of a submerged alligator. The men, veterans of fugitive recovery, were trained to expect desperate, disorganized flight. What they encountered was a map designed specifically for their destruction. The first significant evidence of this intellectual superiority, beyond the cunning of the early losses, occurred near a section of dense palmetto scrub known locally as the Black Womb. The trackers found a small, meticulously constructed cairn of stones, an oddity in the soft alluvial soil. It was not a marker for the fugitive, but a deliberate, almost taunting boundary. According to the fragmentary field notes recovered later by the official inquiry, one of the men, a tracker named Beaumont, refused to cross it. He claimed it was a bad sign, a superstitious fear that Captain Silas dismissed violently, demanding they proceed. Beaumont's subsequent fate, listed in Plantation documents as having succumbed to a massive pulmonary event later that same evening, further eroded the shaky morale of the group. The psychological toll was mounting exponentially faster than the physical exhaustion. The group was now navigating a complex system of false trails. The boy, whose extensive mandatory labor history had included sophisticated dike maintenance and irrigation mapping across the entire acreage, was deploying his engineering knowledge against them. The trails they followed were not routes of escape, but channels designed to funnel them into specific deadly choke points. One morning, the pursuit party found their route blocked by a recently felled cypress. It was an enormous tree, far too large for a single boy to fell with an axe. The stumps, however, indicated precise, repetitive cuts meant to weaken the internal fibers, relying on a subtle shift in the water table, or perhaps a localized gust of wind predicted hours in advance, to complete the felling. It demonstrated forethought spanning weeks, if not months, a horrifying implication that this resistance was not a sudden act of desperation, but a planned, deliberate campaign of retribution. "He anticipated this," whispered Corporal Davies, his voice cracked with heat and doubt, documented later in a sworn testimony. "He waited for us to walk into his machine." This realization was the true turning point, the moment the certainty of the established order completely disintegrated. They were not hunting a frightened child. They were trapped inside a sophisticated operational theater crafted by a keen and vengeful intellect. The losses continued, adopting a pattern that defied conventional tracking experience. They were clean, systematic, and always attributed to natural hazards, masking the intentionality behind the design. The men who vanished did so quietly. One tracker tripped and fell into a bed of razor grass. His body was found hours later, ravaged not by an animal, but by hundreds of minute, deep lacerations that bled him dry before anyone could find him in the dense fog that Kane, the boy, seemed capable of anticipating, even summoning through the manipulation of local water sources. Another man, attempting to refill his canteen at a stagnant pool, simply disappeared beneath the surface, leaving behind only widening rings in the black water, evidence suggesting he had stepped into a disguised, deep pit, strategically dug and covered weeks prior. Captain Silas, the embodiment of the plantation's brutal authority, began to crumble under the relentless intellectual assault. His training had prepared him for riots, for open rebellion, for the simple geography of fear. It had not prepared him for asymmetrical warfare against a foe who understood hydraulics, botany, and regional meteorology better than he understood a rifle. Silas increasingly suspected mutiny among his own men, a common occurrence when morale broke. He accused two remaining trackers of intentionally misreading the trail markers. Yet the trail markers themselves were flawless, drawing directly from the historical documents the Overseer Corps used to identify boundaries. Documents that Kane, the boy, had likely memorized from his years working on the Plantation record system. Kane was communicating with them through the language of their own oppressive bureaucracy, using their rules against them. This erosion of trust manifested in a pattern interrupt so profound it paralyzed the remaining pursuers. They came across their own camp from the night before, seemingly intact but subtly moved. All the remaining water supplies had been fouled with putrid water from the swamp bottom, and their gunpowder stores, while still physically present, had been rendered useless by exposure to meticulously introduced moisture. The boy had circled back through the most dangerous terrain, moved undetected among armed men, and neutralized their ability to sustain the hunt. The silent message was clear. I can touch you whenever I choose. I'm allowing you to remain alive only long enough for the environment to finish its work. The men were surrounded not by walls, but by their own crippling psychological dread. Their rifles, once symbols of invincibility, were now heavy burdens. Their training, an admission of predictable tactics. The surviving group shrank further. They began seeing him, or what they believed to be him, in the periphery. Quick dark movements between the cypress knees, a flash of linen against the gloom. These sightings were always momentary, always insufficient to aim or shoot, and yet they served the critical purpose of maintaining continuous, localized terror. This tactic was highly effective, documented in the psychological literature of asymmetrical conflicts. When the enemy is everywhere and nowhere, the mind begins to turn against itself. 2 more men deserted the primary party during a terrifying night, spent huddled beneath a severe thunderstorm. The storm, heavy and sudden, caused a localized flash flood. When the waters receded, the 2 men had simply taken their small packs and vanished into the darkness, choosing the slim chance of survival alone over the growing certainty of death within Silas's cursed command. The remaining group, now only Silas and 5 subordinates, abandoned the pursuit trajectory entirely, focusing solely on retreating to the boundary of the plantation. But the genius of the plan lay in the fact that the retreat route had been planned and prepared with the same precision as the pursuit traps. Kane had weaponized the geography itself. Every bridge crossing, every patch of high ground, every known obstacle was anticipated. They reached an area known for an ancient rotten pier structure, once used for loading cotton. Silas ordered a desperate night crossing, believing the structure offered the fastest path out of the deepest swamp. As they stepped onto the waterlogged timber, the structure seemed solid enough, a testament to plantation construction. But Kane's subtle engineering had turned it into a massive, patient trap. He had systematically removed only the key structural pegs beneath the waterline weeks before, relying on the humidity and water saturation to hold the integrity of the wood just long enough. The men crossed single file, their nerves frayed to the breaking point. The 4th man across, a corporal named Hayes, made a slight shift in weight. The sound that followed was not an explosion, but a sickening, prolonged tear of ancient wood fibers, giving way under unnatural stress. The section of the pier collapsed not with a bang, but with a horrifying, sucking plunge, dragging Corporal Hayes and the 5th man, Tucker, instantly into the deep, churning waters below. The remaining group scattered, scrambling back to the muddy shore, watching in stunned silence as the dark water swallowed the men. No shouts, no struggle, just the deep, wet silence of the swamp claiming its dues. Silas stood on the bank, his face streaked with mud and disbelief. He had started with 23 armed men, and now only 3 subordinates remained, shivering violently, their training rendered useless, their systemic power nullified. He realized, with a clarity that cut through the humidity, that every move he had made, every path he had chosen, had been a secondary option, calculated by the mind of a 14-year-old boy. This was not resistance. This was a methodical, surgical dismantlement of the system that had oppressed him. The genius of the attack was not focused on maximizing carnage, but on minimizing the ability of the pursuers to fight, isolating them, and allowing the lethal environment of the Louisiana bayou, the same environment that had sickened and killed enslaved people for generations, to become the primary weapon. They were now reduced to crawling back through territory they knew was pre-mapped for their demise. They were hunted by the swamp itself, guided by the unseen hand of a genius who had calculated their trajectory, their fear, and their breaking point, weeks before the first man stepped onto the plantation grounds in pursuit. Silas, the proud face of plantation authority, looked into the black water where his men had vanished, and for the first time since the hunt began, he did not see a fugitive. He saw an engineer, a strategist, and a judge. And he knew with chilling certainty that his own fate had already been sealed in the boys' meticulously drawn plans. They were at the edge of the final confrontation, where the last vestiges of civilized certainty would be stripped away, leaving only the raw terror of a system collapsing under the weight of one boy's impossible, meticulously planned resistance. The air that hung over the ruins of the plantation on the morning of the sixth day was not the usual heavy humidity of the Louisiana bayou. It was a stillness that felt manufactured, a profound absence of human movement replaced by the buzz of insects reclaiming their territory. When the contingent finally arrived, a mixture of the parish sheriff, 2 hired private security men retained by the distant owners, and a small detail of local militiamen, they moved with a hesitancy that belied their armament. They had been dispatched not for a simple retrieval, but to determine the total nature of the catastrophe reported in fragmented, nearly incoherent messages. The initial reports had spoken of fire, of vanished livestock, and, most disturbingly, of an overwhelming silence. What they found was not merely the aftermath of an insurrection, but the chilling evidence of systematic deconstruction. The central big house remained structurally intact, but its interior had been gutted with a calculated precision. Every paper, ledger, and accounting record pertaining to the plantation's operations, its assets, and crucially its inventory of human property, had been collected and incinerated in a controlled blaze in the massive hearth, leaving nothing but fine grey ash scattered across the polished floorboards. This was not the work of spontaneous rage, but of an intelligence focused on eradicating the plantation's bureaucratic existence. The true scale of the devastation was visible in the critical infrastructure. The cotton gin, the heart of the operation, was a ruin of twisted metal and charred cypress wood. The molasses storehouse, which had been full just a week prior, was emptied. The expensive, sweet liquid deliberately poured into the main irrigation canals, fouling the water source for miles downstream and effectively rendering the nearby crop fields useless for the foreseeable future. The system of destruction was economically targeted, ensuring that even if the manpower were instantly replaced, the means of production would be non-existent for at least a season, perhaps 2. This level of comprehensive sabotage spoke volumes about the mind behind it, a mind that understood the levers of power better than those who owned them. They began the grim inventory of the missing. The tally was precise and terrifying. 23 men dispatched in the initial pursuit and subsequent security detail. Of those, only 5 were found alive, and none were coherent. These few survivors were discovered miles from the main plantation, wandering aimlessly, suffering from extreme dehydration, exposure, and a psychological trauma so acute that they could provide no actionable intelligence, only disjointed pleas and terrified whispers regarding the shadows and the swamp that fights back. The remains of the remaining 18 men were scattered in a radius of 3 miles around the plantation's perimeter. Investigators noted with a growing sense of dread the patterns of their demise. The initial losses were attributed, as per the official reports later filed, to natural hazards of the bayou. But the consistency of these accidents was mathematically improbable. One man, the former head overseer, was found tangled in dense vines near the main trail, his heavy musket still clutched in his hand unused. However, the vines had been artificially strengthened and knotted at specific critical points, designed not merely to trip, but to hold fast, leading to fatal exposure. Another was discovered in a sinkhole that had been cleverly concealed with carefully placed palmetto fronds, a trap requiring significant forethought and knowledge of the shifting marsh geology. The records detail a finding that truly broke the morale of the investigation team: the remains of Captain Pierce, the leader of the external search party brought in after the initial failures. Pierce was found on a small, dry knoll, approximately 4 miles from the plantation limits. He was surrounded by the spent casings of his own ammunition, indicating a ferocious but futile last stand. Crucially, the physical evidence suggested that Pierce had run out of targets long before he ran out of bullets. He had fired wildly, driven by panic and an unseen adversary. Closing the loops of the narrative required meticulous reconstruction of the evidence left behind by the architect of this chaos. Investigators discovered small, almost invisible markings left near critical trail junctions. Notches in trees, broken branches turned at specific angles, a signaling system that only the boy, referred to simply as the subject in the later documents, would understand. The investigation concluded definitively that the subject had not relied on a single weapon nor brute force, but on the environment itself, manipulated through weeks, perhaps months, of calculated preparation. Evidences suggested that the subject had meticulously cached supplies, small stores of dried meat and carefully collected medicinal herbs, along a predetermined escape route that snaked directly through the most impenetrable sections of the cypress swamp. Furthermore, remnants of simple but devastatingly effective tools were recovered. Pieces of sharpened shell used as cutting implements, small weights crafted from packed clay used to disarm or distract, and, most damningly, evidence of the sophisticated knowledge applied to poison ivy and toxic bayou flora, intentionally placed in the pathways and near the scarce sources of potable water known to the pursuers. The final report, submitted to the state authorities, acknowledged a truth the owners desperately tried to deny. This was not a matter of a few spontaneous acts of defiance. It was a sophisticated, military-grade campaign of guerrilla resistance executed by a single individual who possessed superior logistical foresight and an encyclopedic knowledge of the terrain. The formal conclusion, deliberately obscured in bureaucratic euphemism, stated that the losses were the result of a highly organized effort of indigenous subversion, exploiting geographical vulnerabilities. The fate of the protagonist, the 14-year-old boy known in the Plantation's destroyed records only by the name Elijah, remains historically unresolved. He was never recaptured. His disappearance became absolute, fueling immediate and pervasive legends that spread like wildfire throughout the entire bayou region. Authorities poured resources into the pursuit for months, offering ever-increasing rewards, yet he had simply evaporated into the expansive wilderness of Louisiana. Documented theories regarding his destination are numerous, reflecting the deep anxieties and hopes of the era. Some plantation owners desperately maintained that he perished in the vast, unforgiving marsh, claiming that no human could survive the environmental exposure for that duration. However, the enslaved communities whispered a different story, one passed in secret songs and coded tales. The prevalent belief held that Elijah had utilized his immense topographical knowledge to navigate the dense network of waterways leading directly toward the burgeoning maroon communities established deep within the swamps. Communities renowned for offering refuge and often employing organized resistance against the established order. A smaller, yet historically resonant theory, supported by some sympathetic abolitionist sources in the North, suggested a path even further, that his sophisticated planning had included a prearranged connection with the Underground Railroad network operating near the Mississippi River. Given the calculated eradication of all documents tied to his existence and status, Elijah, upon gaining freedom, would have been able to reinvent himself completely, escaping the system not only physically, but legally. He became a ghost, an unsubstantiated rumor to the authorities, but a profound symbol to those he left behind. The immediate impact of this singular act of resistance was transformative locally. The total economic collapse of the plantation, the destruction of the crop, the machinery, and the forced financial loss of 23 men, compounded by the required rebuilding and land cleanup, rendered the estate unsalvageable. It was sold off in fragments, its soil eventually used for smaller, less intensive operations. The centralized plantation model in that immediate microregion suffered a verifiable systemic shock. The incident forced neighboring owners to drastically restructure their security protocols, increasing the paranoia and expense associated with maintaining their system of oppression. More importantly, the story of the genius boy who destroyed his entire world before disappearing into the mist became an immediate and enduring symbol of hope and extreme resistance. It was proof that the system, despite its seemingly insurmountable power and overwhelming resources, was fragile and vulnerable to acute, calculated intelligence. The story of Elijah, the boy who replaced brute force with strategic annihilation, served as a foundational narrative of defiance, a quiet assurance passed down that the human spirit, even when confined and brutalized, retained the capacity for total, comprehensive self-determination. The documents relating to this catastrophe, though deliberately fragmented and filed under mundane headings like loss of property, fire-related, survive today, bearing witness not to a criminal act, but to a profound statement of human refusal to be owned. This history, like so many others detailing the impossible resistance against the institutionalized horror of chattel slavery, a system recognized today as a crime against humanity, was systematically erased from the official curriculum. It survived because the magnitude of the destruction was too great to fully conceal, leaving statistical scars and psychological damage that are clearly visible in the archival records of the time. This story compels us to look beyond the generalized horror of the era and focus on the power inherent in individual resistance. The moments documented where the oppressed, armed with nothing but knowledge, strategic foresight, and unwavering will, found ways not only to survive, but to dismantle the instruments of their subjugation. If you are compelled by these deeply researched historical narratives of extreme resistance, documented moments where the impossible became reality, and the fragments of history that the official records attempted to bury,